Hi, this is Doug Clinton, one of the co-founders of Loop Ventures. My goal over the next 10 minutes or so is to explain to you a theory we have about the compression and utility of information and how that will influence technology adoption in the future. When we talk about information, we really have to start with Claude Shannon and his information theory, which was the basis for the creation of the bit, the zeros and ones that represent information transferred digitally. Those zeros and ones, they can make up a song or a video or even an email. In Shannon's piece on information theory, he used this diagram that shows how a message begins with a creator on the left. It gets encoded into machine language, transferred through some noisy channel, then decoded for the message receiver to consume on the right. Now, the interesting thing here is that Shannon realized the meaning of information couldn't be represented in this transfer paradigm. Bits don't really mean anything, they just convey a message. And so it's left to the receiver to decipher the meaning from the creator of the message. As a byproduct, we don't really talk about transferring information in units of meaning, but in bits, usually in bits per second, like our internet speed. However, whether we need to know the answer to a simple question or want to be entertained or we're seeking something more existential, meaning is the reason we consume information. This detachment of meaning from information really feels suboptimal as we think about the future of technology. So we tried to look at Shannon's work through the lens of meaning, and this is what we came up with. Using Shannon's same diagram, we have a creator to the left who intends some meaning in their message, and a consumer on the right who interprets the meaning of that message. And in the middle, there's this sort of holistic noise between the two parties. Of course, this transfer mechanism happens over time. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, so time is sort of persistent through the process. There's sort of a lot going on here, so let's start with the high-level concept of meaning. All meaning in this scenario starts at the information source with the creator on the left. Without some information to be conveyed, there can be no meaning and there's nothing to transfer in this scenario. However, while all meaning starts with the creator, all meaning must be interpreted by the consumer, and thus the determination of meaning and its relative value is subject to the consumer on the right-hand side. Now let's quickly touch on holistic noise that sits between the information creator and the consumer. In Shannon's model, noise distorts the digital signal, which can impair the message transfer, so it can actually degrade the message. Holistic noise is not a distortion in the message, but a distortion in the transference of meaning from one side to the other. And this may be due to any number of factors like lack of clarity in the message from the creator. It could be inability to understand the message by the consumer, or it could even be a misinterpretation by the consumer on purpose or otherwise. Less holistic noise in almost all cases should mean a closer interpretation of the message by the consumer relative to the creator's intent. So that is our brief overview on meaning and how meaning applies to this information theory conception. But not all meaning is created equally, and that's where the theory on information utility comes in. Meaning divided by time is how we measure the utility of information. And this is sort of analogous to marginal utility in economics, where one ranks the value of consumer goods, allowing a person to make decisions about where they want to spend their money. There's a duality here to point out in the word meaning. It's not only the interpreted intent of a message, as we just described in the diagram prior, but also the value of that interpreted intent. How meaningful is the meaning you consume? Taking the idea one step further, to improve utility, you have to compress more meaningful meaning, M, into less time, T. You can do that in really one of three ways. You can make a message easier to interpret. The easier something is to interpret, the less holistic noise it should have, and the less time it takes to consume that meaning, therefore utility increases. You can add more meaning to a message or make it more meaningful by enhancing it in some way. Or you can control time by manipulating or restricting it to convey the message faster. Notice two core things here. First, almost all information compression has to happen on the side of the creator. The creator is in charge of how easy something is to interpret, how much meaning they're putting into it to begin with, and how much time they think it will take to consume. One fringe example where the consumer can compress information is watching videos or listening to audiobooks on double speed. So a scenario where you're giving the consumer time control, but that's really about it. The consumer will never be able to make something easier to interpret or more meaningful. That has to start with creation. The second thing to realize here is that compression is not about relevance of the message. Relevance tools like search optimize a set of messages, not a single message. So relevance does improve meaning divided by time in this sort of aggregate measure by unearthing the right message in a pool of messages, but it doesn't improve meaning divided by time for a specific message. Only compression can do that. The fundamental insight here as it applies to technology companies is that consumers will spend more time with products that improve meaning divided by time. So with that thought in mind, let's go from philosophy to application with some real-world examples. First, GIFs, something that probably everyone is pretty familiar with. GIFs compress information in two of the three ways. They make messages easier to interpret because they're more efficient at conveying emotion and intent than a holistically noisier channel like text. If someone responds to you with a text that says just okay, you might think that they're mad at you or something else. If they respond to you with a GIF, it's much clearer what their intent is, and they're probably having fun, which is actually the second benefit of GIFs. They add more meaning through entertainment. The fun of GIFs enhance the meaning conveyed relative to things like text or emoji that are more static. The second example are vines. So vines are an example of using time restriction to convey more meaning in less time. And for a vine or some other time restricted video, the restriction actually makes the creator get to the point faster and in a more creative way, thus enforcing more meaning in less time for the consumer. In a way, Twitter sort of stumbled onto this with the 140 character limit that it's now moving away from, but we actually think that's a mistake. Restrictions are always effective ways to compress information. Augmented reality compresses information by making it more meaningful. So when information can be overlaid on the real world, it's easier for the consumer to interpret, as we see here. When you can see instructions about how to do something right on top of the project you're working on, or the thing you're trying to learn about, like a dinosaur, it makes the information easier to apply. AR, like GIFs, can also enhance information by adding additional elements to make it more meaningful. An example that probably most of us are familiar with is Snapchat filters that add more fun to the messaging process on Snapchat. The last example I'll give, and this is a personal favorite of Loop Ventures, is brain-computer interfaces, or BCI. If you're not familiar, BCIs are a tool that allow for the human brain and a computer to communicate. So think of it as sort of a read-write relationship between the two. And in the future, knowing what signals in the brain correspond to some intended output, and then how to translate those signals for another person to understand, could, at least in theory, completely eliminate holistic noise, making messages easier to understand and increasing meaning over time. While we're decades away from BCI being a commonplace thing for human beings, the net result will inevitably be this sort of massive compression of information. So that's it. That's what information compression is all about. I hope this overview made sense and maybe even inspires you to brainstorm creative ways to compress information or use products that compress information for you. As we think about what new technology platforms will change how we communicate with each other, we feel very strongly that the idea of assessing them by meaning divided by time will be kind of this key determining factor. So if you're working on a project related to information compression, or if you're just interested in the concept and want to share feedback, we'd love for you to howl at us. Thanks for watching.